Let me get a little piece of interfacing because that takes up time. Interface, placket. Oh wait, you have 3 more ruffles.
Well, I have 1 shirt.
Yeah.
But yes,
You know what? Whichever of these is the widest and longest, ruffle on the ruffler.
Okay.
But give me this one or that one for him. It doesn't matter which one. I'll take either one of these with a lace edge on it next. Okay. Decide.
Got it.
Cool.
So I'll do this one real quick.
With a lace edge.
With the lace edge, and do you want it with the feather stitch or no?
No,
Just-
that one you'll
I'll
just
just serge
serge
it,
it and
lace
bring
it, right?
and put the pin on it so I know which one it is. Yeah.
That?
Okay, tell everybody I'm sorry. I just have to, so much work goes into this. Try.
We'll be starting in a second.
Okay, I'm almost there. We'll see if everybody. Hi, good morning. We'll see who can hear me over the other machines because it's a wild day here. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? I never bring anything flattering to wear. Like, try to suck my gut in for you guys. Let's see. Let me look. Hey, hey, hey. Okay, just getting started. It's recording. It's recording. Okay, so we've got so much going on today with this skirt. And I think what we're going to do is kind of show you where we're at right now. And then I'm going to show you, several steps of what we did to get where we're at now. And then we're going to do some sewing. And then I think what I'll do, which has just kind of become our habit, is like Friday, we'll make a video, whoever's around, of just showing the whole thing done. Because putting all these ruffles on takes a long time, but we're working on it, and we've got lots to show you today. So I'm going to first grab the petticoat here and show you where we're at. So if you remember from yesterday, we used the same pattern as the skirt to create a pattern for the petticoat. So when this goes on her body, the side of it with the ruffles is going to go against her. So we have the wrong side, or the bad side of the petticoat is facing out. Oh, here, I need a clip. I need to clip the rest of my microphone on. So we've got the lining side. Is that on? That's on. Good enough. Yeah. Thank you, Sabina. The raw side, or the seam side, where the seams are, is going to go to the back side of the pink set of ruffles.
Your mic is facing in.
Oh, am I scratchy? Hang on. We're doing some sound stuff. No, it still is. Is that better?
Yeah.
Test, test, test. How scratchy are we? Okay, so the lining side of the petticoat is going to go, the wrong side of the petticoat is going to face the wrong side of the pink apparatus, so that on the inside it's pretty, on the outside it's pretty. So what I'm going to show you that Sabina did for us this morning is the hem of this has a piece of horsehair braid folded into it, kind of like a wedding dress or a prom gown. I'm going to show you how we put that in. So we're going to put the horsehair to the right side and fold it all the way over, and then stitch it again. And that, the horsehair here, you can see it kind of makes a little bit of springy going on to help hold the whole thing out a little bit. So if you want the dress to be less springy, don't put the horsehair in. You could just hem it. And then to make our ruffle for the bottom, we did the same thing. We just measured on our pattern This is our third. So this ruffle is a third the length of the whole thing. And to jazz it up, and since I have like 300 yards of mint lace, we put a piece of mint lace on the bottom edge of the ruffle. And we applied it flat onto the petticoat. So we do have a serged edge here that's just laid onto the petticoat. If you want, you can apply a piece of lace over this. This is a great place to put a piece of lace with a few little bows every now and then if that's the vibe you're going for. The other thing you can do is fold it up, stitch it on, and then let it fall down. So it just depends on the aesthetic you're going for and how much work you want to do. But probably what we're going to do is just leave it flat and put a piece of lace on it to cover it up. So let me put this on the dress for him, and then we can just kind of start to see the shape we're getting. And these ruffled skirts are pretty full as they are without a petticoat. So the petticoat is really, oh, I don't have any pins. The petticoat is really like to add, it adds more fullness, but they're pretty full anyway. And then like the petticoat is good for a party girl. It's also good for Spanish. You know, it really just depends on time and money. You know, if you're not getting paid enough to put a petticoat in, skip the petticoat. But you can see that the horsehair down there, and we're going to give it a steam when we're all done. The horsehair is helping hold out all these nice, pretty waves here. And then when she's in movement, you'll see glimpses of that pink lace and stuff underneath. This is also pretty even for like a Giselle or the inside layer of a romantic tutu. It's pretty to make an organza or a chiffon, probably not chiffon, but you can do it, to make an organza petticoat and then build a romantic tutu over the top, because the weight of this in a romantic, if you build a romantic over this, the weight of this really helps the romantic tutu fly out. And then those little soft ruffles underneath, people are just like, oh, look at that. I didn't expect that little soft ruffle. Okay, so I'm going to show you how we put the horsehair in the hem of that. The other thing we're going to look at, we're going to peek at what we've got so far on the overskirt before we stick some ruffles on to look at. We've got all of our pieces going together straight to bias. So and the stripe makes it really evident that you can see we have a straight line next to a bias line. But what's great is that it doesn't grow. And the only place it can hang a little bit is next to the bias. But once the rows of ruffles go on, it's not going to droop or bag out as much as if we did 4 gores, or as much as if we did just a circle. If we cut just a circle, this will be a whole hot mess. And actually, that makes me think of one other thing that I was going to show yesterday. If you really want to fight droopiness, right? If you really want to make sure that nothing ever goes droopy at the bottom, the other thing you can do is take a piece, I don't have it over here, you can take a piece of twill tape or a piece of satin ribbon that matches or whatever you want. You can measure the length of your seam and lay an extra piece of tape in the center of each piece and zigzag over it. So you could put a pink ribbon in the middle of each one of these, and that'll make it even less likely to grow. The other thing that makes it even less likely to grow is if you did this with 16 gores, which I do sometimes, but it is a lot more work and it's a little bit of overkill. Let me have some coffee, because like I'm feeling it today. I hope you couldn't hear me drinking coffee. So now I want to show you, Sabina seamed this together this morning. We'll do a little sample of it. But she put her 2 pieces right side together with the bias on the bottom. She straight stitched it. And then instead of French seaming, because nobody's going to be impressed by our French seams because they don't show in a costume like this, she pushed her seam allowance. She pressed all of her seam allowance one direction. So it's like a music group. Press your seam allowance one direction, and then she zigzagged right next to the edge, catching, if you can see here, she goes right just like a stitch to the edge, and that'll keep that from fraying out over time. It keeps it flat, It uses less thread than a serger, and you don't have to go back and forth to your serger. So she straight stitched her seams, pushed them one way, and stitched them. Now, if this wasn't getting covered in ruffles, you might consider French seaming it together. So let me just right quick here lay our 8 gores over the top of that. And then I'm going to show you, besides the horsehair, a different way that you can hem this using some bias that matches. So we're getting there. We've got stuff going on. And Sabina has done some of our ruffles, which can you grab me that box, Jared? Yeah. Thank you. It's so great to have people that just run around while I'm tied to a microphone, even though he had to undo more stuff than I had to undo. Okay, so let's just kind of check out where we're at with ruffles, but we're going to put a couple layers on. We have our second row done up and ruffled here, and we've got Katura is serging the bottoms, and she's putting a nice lace edge on. So there's our second one. Here's our longest one. And these ones that are super long, we were able to get it pretty close with the ruffling machine. But then I'm going to show you again with the pleater how we can use that, and everybody knows how to gather with a gathering stitch. And I'm hoping actually that one of these two doesn't fit on our skirt, and that we either have to scrunch it, thank you, that we either have to scrunch it in a little or pop some stitches, because that's the other way you can approach this, is to divide it into your 8 gores, and then each section make it a little longer or a little smaller. So I'm going to show you that too. It's like cheating, but it's practical cheating. Okay, so we don't need to really look at these on here until I've got some pinned on. But right, so there's where we're heading here shortly. So let me show you the horsehair finish and a bias finish for the skirt bases, and then we're going to peek at what our basque looks like right now. Jared made the basque this morning. So we've got our back, which is longer, in our front. And since I'm here, I'm going to pin it together really quick. And I'm a sucker for piping, so we are going to pipe the bottom edge of this. And I'm also going to show you today how to make a really nice placket for the back of this that you can just stick right over all of the ruffles. It's a really great way to make a placket, which is the closing in the back. I'm going to show you how to use one great big rectangle to do it, but you can also do it with a long skinny rectangle. And then like on a man's shirt cuff, you know, that's also called a placket, the thing that's like back here. You can also do it with bias. There's different ways, but I'm going to show you a good skirt one. And we're going to finish off the top of this with elastic. Now, if you've done a tutu class with me, you'll know a lot of times I cut a Hollywood basque, which is taller. That also works great for something like this. So if she's wearing a bodice over this, which we're assuming she is, you can also cut a higher waisted basque just to prevent the bodice from showing. Okay, let me wind a bobbin real quick. And first we're going to do putting the horsehair in sample. So you just like have to imagine I've got the whole hem of the skirt. Oh, I hope I have a foot pedal that works. We'll know here in a second. I had a pink one threaded, and then we took it to the suburbs yesterday and left it. Whoops. If you don't follow us on Instagram, follow us on Instagram. We put up a little teaser of the Mother Ginger giant that we're making right now. And it's looking pretty darn cool. And Phil, who was crabby last year because he had to wear wig and a makeup, is pretty excited this year because he just has to wear a giant backpack and nobody can see him. Although me, who is a scene stealer, likes the attention you get in a Mother Ginger costume. Okay, horsehair at the hem. That's what we're going to do here first. If anybody watched Martha Stewart before she went to prison, she liked to stand and sew. My bobbin case doesn't work. There we go. So I'm gonna be like Martha Stewart today, pre-prison. So when you're messing with the horsehair braid in a hem, you have to kind of imagine, right, even though that the horsehair is a flexible thing, that you're bending it into a circle. So one thing you want to not do is, so we just have a little skinny horsehair. So the wider, so we've got narrow horsehair braid, and it's real flexible. So the wider the horsehair is, you have to be conscious, if this was my hem, you have to make sure that as you're sewing the edge on, that when you fold it up, it's ending up fitting it, and then that it's not too full or too tight. So it's kind of, you've got to watch your like internal tension as you lay this stuff down, because we don't want to make the horsehair braid shrink the hem. If we pull it too much while we're sewing it on, it's going to be too big, and we don't want to scrunch it in too much as we're sewing it on. It's going to be too small. So you just kind of want to make a sample with whatever width you're using to see if you're getting a bad result. Then if you're getting a bad result, you kind of have to, you know, go and figure out what is causing that. And I'm going to sew this little edge on pink because it will show better instead of white on white on white. Okay, so this chunk of pink here that is in my left hand, we're imagining that this is the hem of our skirt, that this, where my finger is the bottom of our set of gores. So we put all the gores together, but we left an opening, which really isn't going to be our center back, but it's easier to lay the ruffles on when the skirt isn't in a circle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a piece of my horsehair braid, and I'm going to lie it right there on the edge. And I'm going to stitch a 1/4 inch in, because we gave a 1/4 inch hem on our skirt, and then we're going to fold and fold. So it's going to look like that. So I'm going to lay it on there, stitch a 1/4, then we're going to fold it and fold it so that we have a real nice finish, and you still see a little bit of the horsehair braid. You can also add more seam allowance and stitch it further so that when you fold and fold, you actually encase the whole piece of braid. That's up to you. I'm just showing you kind of the basics. And the few wedding dresses I've had to alter, this stuff is a nightmare, right? It's awful to take it. And oh my gosh, it's so wide. I like 1 inch one, 2 inch one. This one's a 1/2 inch one, which is a little thin, but you know, we're using what we got. And I cannot get that into the machine. Okay, so the thing is, the bottom of my skirt has some flex. My horsehair has some flex. I don't really want to pull on either of them, so I'm just going to go section by section and use the pins that are connected to my hands and sew this down. This is one of those things too, it's like, you know, we all learn to sew from someone, and you may have learned to sew from somebody that's like, you have to pin everything. And don't get me wrong, I'm a pinner, but sometimes pinning is not your friend because it eats up time, and you should be able to do something like this without a pin. So that's the piece of a braid stitched on. Whoa, it's like a spring. Stitched on first. And it's the end of the roll too, so it's real tight. We're going to steam this. Then, so I've stitched it on. Now I'm going to fold it and fold it a second time and re-stitch it. So I'm actually going to work from the other end because I want all of my goods on the left. I don't want to be sewing with stuff over here. Whenever possible, you want to sew with stuff over there. Now, I'm going to do, and you can do a little bitty zigzag to catch over the edge if you want, or you can do a little bitty straight stitch. There's no right answer. And the other thing, this edge that's here, I'm using my fingers to make sure that the horsehair is tied up against there. You don't want there to be little air bubbles and have play. You want to make it nice and crisp. And I can actually even shrink my zigzag a little bit. Then we're going to press it. And actually, even, you know, this skirt, this ruffled skirt, you can get away without the horsehair. I find it's easier to hem it. Like I'm actually, in a way, the horsehair is a hemming aid. Also, like if we serge this edge, we're going to stretch it out when we serge it, and then it's going to be hard to get it to fold up and look as nice and scrumptious as this does. So look at that. I mean, that looks, it looks like it came from a store. Let me iron it and make it less springy. Oh no, the iron went to sleep. Or it's not on. There we go. Silly home iron. Oh, that worked. So now it's hanging really nice, and it doesn't have that big coil in it. So actually when we press our petticoat, so in the petticoat, in the white is where we put the horsehair. When we press it, that's going to be just great. This is also fun to do ruffled collars for like little kid clown things and stuff. Okay, now let me show you the other way that I like to hem stuff like this, which is using a piece of bias that matches. So I have bias of my organza with the satin stripe. I just cut a couple different widths because I'm not sure what width it is I'm really going to use. And let me get another little test piece here. Okay, so piece in my left hand, we're imagining that this is the, let me get a bigger piece. There's enough of this stuff. And guess what? Our Mother Ginger costume is getting a mega ruffle out of this stuff. It's like I bought it with two things in mind. Ha ha ha. So let me just cut a bigger piece of this. And let me cut a horrible angle in it to kind of simulate more of what's going on a skirt like this. This also looks good on a just a straight, you know, like a dirndl on a dirndl skirt. So there's a couple different ways you can do this. So we're going to use this piece of bias kind of like the horsehair that we just had. So the first one is you can take your piece of bias and write. So what I'm thinking of in my head, let me actually cut more of a curve like this. When you're putting a piece of bias on a hem or anywhere, you also have to think about that where it's laying up to. So my hem is here. If I just lay the bias on completely flat, I'm going to have to ease the top of it on a little bit because it's about circumferences, right? We're going up a circle. It's getting narrower. So what I'm actually going to do on the horsehair, I said, don't stretch it. Just lay it down because it's a skinny piece of horsehair. What I'm going to do with this bias is stretch it just a little bit as I sew it on so that when I fold this over, my top edge will match. And then the flex of the bias, even though I'm pulling it a little bit, once we press it, the hem will relax, okay? So I'm going to first stitch this with 1/4 of an inch. So this is option one of any number of ways you can do this with a piece of bias. So I'm pulling the top a little bit because I don't want the top of my bias to be ruffly when I'm all done. And you've just got to like guess and test this. Use the scientific method here. So I'm pulling my top a little bit. I'm not pulling the bottom. So I'm using both hands like a machine in a factory. Don't judge my crooked sewing. I'm using both hands to make what I want happen. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to press this over. So right now we've got the outside of the skirt. I'm going to press this over to the inside like that. And you can, because bias doesn't really unravel, you decide what you want to do. You could just do a zigzag over this edge, or if you want to impress your friends, you can put the other fold of the bias in. So that's actually what I'm going to do. I'm going to press it and then press a fold. And let me move her. So I started with the bias on the outside. And actually, to help it press to the inside, I'm going to warm it up on the outside first, really quick. And then I'm going to fold it over. And then I'm going to press my seam allowance towards the bias. I'm going to press it all towards the bias first. We use strips of bias for so much stuff. I know some people are like, oh, I hate bias. But if you learn to love it, you'll be in a good place with bias. Everybody needs to improve their relationship with bias. So now I'm using my hand to kind of work the edge out. You could even press that seam open instead of pressing it down. And like different thicknesses of fabric kind of want to do a different thing. So if one thing isn't working, try something else. So now I'm going to go put a second fold in this. You could fold it all the way behind the hem and make it really skinny. That looks nice. Let's do that. So now I'm folding my last top edge to my seam. And see, it wants to lay down really great, and that's because we put that stretch in it. If we didn't stretch it a little bit, this edge that I'm pressing down now wouldn't want to press down. Then we're going to fold it up. All right, that's a ton of pressing, but it looks really nice when you're done. And this piece of bias that's in here, right, we're thickening up the edge. It actually acts in a way kind of like the horsehair does. So now we're gonna stitch this edge down. Now you could use bias on like any other types of skirts too. And if you want, you can fold it and use a blind stitch. If you don't know the blind stitch on your sewing machine, look it up so that you don't even have any stitching showing on the outside. But since this is getting covered with ruffles and because it's for theatrical use, I don't care if the top stitching shows through. So now I am just going to stitch right along that edge. I could have pressed it a little bit better. The other thing when you're ironing, you don't want to get little chicken lips where it looks like two beaks coming together. And, right, so the other thing is I'm working along. If it seems like I'm getting a header behind the top and bottom of the fabric, you might want to use an awl or a stiletto and just work the twist in. Because like as fabric twists, if you just keep sewing, you're only like magnifying the twist. So you want each edge to be sewn down where it should be sewn down there. I got past my little twist there. And the twist was happening where I have more bias in the skirt for it. You could also flip this over and sew it from the other side, but you just want to be mindful of really where your stitch is happening. Oh, no thread cutter. So that's another really super great way to hem something like this. And you're going to have ruffles. So here's our outside. You're going to have ruffles hanging over this. But that little edge just looks really slick. And to me, it looks better than serging and folding up the serging. Like I wrestle more with folding up serging than I do something like this. Now let me show you kind of the other option of this that's even a little bit faster. So that piece of bias was like 1 3/4 inches wide. Now I have a piece that's 2 1/4 inches wide. I have a wider piece. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just fold it in half. So I'm taking my wider piece, folding it in half, and I'm going to stitch that along the edge. Then I just have to fold it up and press it instead of a fold and a fold. So actually I'm going to do a little bit less on this one. So I have a wider piece of bias that's like 2 1/4. And again, you know, it might not be 2 1/4 the next time. Just kind of test out what works. So now I've got a folded piece of bias that I'm going to stretch a little bit. as I sew around there. So now when we're done, we don't have to do a fold and a fold. We've like skipped a step in a good way. Less pressing. Oh, I kind of went off the line. Less pressing, less sewing. More money in your pocket. Yesterday when we were putting our huge puppet together, somebody said, "Are you donating this?" No way. Got to put food on the table. Got to keep chips on the chip shelf at the shop. So now I'm going to do the same thing. Actually, this one, you know what? With this fabric, I can feel that I want to actually press the seam allowance up. Where a wool or cotton, you might want to press it down. So try like 2 or 3 ways with everything you're doing to see what works. Then we're going to press this up. And it's a little less to deal with if you start with the folded piece. And it looks really, really, really nice. So you would top stitch that edge. So that's using a folded piece of bias to make a really nice hem. Okay? Cool. Any questions about what I just did with horsehair or bias? If not, we are going to make, we're going to simulate a closure in the back of this sucker. And then we're going to put like part of 2 rows of ruffles on. Question? No? Okay, here we go. Yes. We have an incoming question that says,
does this work well with silk chiffon?
Does this work well with silk chiffon? It does work with silk chiffon, but silk chiffon is got a mind of its own. So you will wrestle with it some, but I have hemmed silk chiffon with a piece of bias like this. And it does, you know, it does make a little bit of a wave more so than organza, but it will work. The other thing to think about with chiffon is, can you hem it with a piece of organza? Like, instead of having two snotty fabrics to work with, can you use a less snotty fabric? And like, I consider organza something much easier to work with than like Georgette or silk chiffon or China silk. Let's make a placket. I'm gonna center myself. Okay, so what we've got is, I'm going to start with just a rectangle. Okay, so we're imagining that this is the center back of my skirt. And actually, why don't I stick a ruffle on it so that we can kind of get the idea of dealing with a ruffle with a placket. So I'm going to just take a piece of pink. So skirt base, right? Eventually up here is going to be our basque skirt base. We're saying that this is actually the center back and that there's a ruffle here. So even though we're leaving our skirt open with one seam undone, I don't want a seam in the center front of her dress. I want a flat panel. So that means if we have 8 gores, she's got a flat panel in the front and a flat panel in the back. So this is going to be our flat panel. So I'm going to just say, here's the seams, right? Here's our center back. We want a center back somewhere in here. So let me just stick on a ruffle so that we've kind of got the idea of like what dealing with a ruffle and a closure is. And you can totally put a seam in the center back if you want. The other thing that you can do is, you know, we've got 8 gores. You could say that your center back one, you could divide a gore in half so that you can have a seam in the center back. So we're just simulating the ruffle or ruffles that are going to be in your way for the closure in the back. And again, this is just one way to do it, but I find it works for a skirt like this. That's enough ruffles. So this is going to eventually be our closure in the center back, but we've got a ruffle hanging right over it. You can elect to make the ruffles stop on each side of it, is also an option. So we all understand that. Just put it on so your ruffles end up on each side of it. But I like to show you something different. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stick my ruffles right here in the center back. So I'm going to just jam down my ruffles with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So this is like a different way to do it that also works, and you can adapt it to other stuff. I keep forgetting that cutter doesn't work. Okay, so what we've got here is our center back with ruffles going right over it. Here's my center back, and I've got a ruffle going right over it. I am going to use this silk for the placket for this, or you could interface a piece of the skirt stuff. It's totally up to you, but I'm going to start with a rectangle. So we're going to take a rectangle, stick it on here, and use it to make the closure of the skirt. So I am going to just arbitrarily, this is where making samples is good. You can find out what it is you really like. But let's say we're going to start with maybe 6 inches to have a reference point. So I'm going to start with a rectangle that's 6 inches. And then I want to figure out how far down do I want my closure to go. So 2 inches of this closure is coming from the waist down to the high hip. So we only need like 3 or 4 inches more. So we're going to say that we're going to have from our waist, like 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's do 5. We're going to do 5 more inches of opening plus an extra inch to go below the opening. So I'm going to cut us, actually, am I cutting a square that's 6 by 6? I'm cutting a square. Now, if your skirt goes all the way up to the waist, you obviously need more opening. And the bigger the person's butt is, the more opening you need also. Now, I am going to interface this because there's going to be tension on this. So I'm going to cut a piece of armor weft interfacing, which is just woven interfacing. If you know what Pellon is, that's like the grosser option. Pellon doesn't have bias in it, and it tends to bubble more, where a woven interfacing like this has bias, and it moves more like your fabric does, causing it to like stay stuck longer. So I'm going to interface this first. I'm not hiding anything, I'm just interfacing. Look, oh, I'm caught on the cords. And actually, the next thing you could do is serge around 3 sides of this. So if it were a rectangle, you'd serge the long sides, the short side, the long side. You don't need to serge the waist because it's going to get hooked. It's going to get hooked somewhere else later. Actually, you could serge the waist too if you want. It's not really the waist, it's the high hip. But since our serger is making ruffles, I'm going to just use a zigzag and pretend that's my serge. So I'm going to go around all 4 sides. So this is in lieu of serging this. And actually, I've got the selvage edge at the bottom. You wouldn't even have to serge that. You could say it's part of your plan. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is just fold whatever. So this is the hip, this is the hem. I'm going to fold it into thirds and give it a press. Beautiful. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So I just folded it into thirds, and I'm going to give it an iron. So I've got it, I've pressed it into thirds. If you're jobless, are you jobless? Yeah, she could start serging the bottoms of those rectangles, right? Right there, you only need to serge 1 long edge of each. 1 long edge of each, yeah. We're making this cool old-timey trim that I'll show you guys here in a little bit before we're done. It's like we're making a ruffle and trimming it. Okay, so what did we do? We have a thing that's going to become our placket. Get the Vogue book and look up placket if you're not sure what I'm talking about. And actually, this is like a summer theater placket because it's quick but effective. So we press this in thirds. And what we're going to start with is one of the thirds is going to be on the left side of us. So I'm going to draw a line right here. And we don't want our closure to go all the way to the bottom. We're going to leave like an inch. So this, actually, I've got it the wrong way. This, oh, I have it the wrong way, you guys. Let me draw another line. Let me just draw all the thirds in. I want my right side of the garment to overlap the left side. This will all become clear in a second. So on my center back, again, kind of here's my center back line, working the way down there. We're going to put 1/3 of this to the right of the center back. So let me get some pins. And doing this right through the ruffles, the first thing you're going to do is get some of your ruffles out of the way. And a totally acceptable thing too is if like this little ruffle's going to, if I fear he's going to be too much in my way, I'm going to just clip him and move him out of my way. Totally fine. Make your life easier. So I don't want my ruffles getting caught up weird in this closure. So I'm going to first pin my ruffles out of the equation so that they're not getting in my way. Now this first third is going to go on the right. So this line is going to match what we've said is the center back line. And I'm checking to see if that I don't have ruffles doing weird things underneath. And I am going to pin along that line in a couple spots. How did that flower pin get in here? This is a yellow quilting pin only place. Now what I'm going to do is that line is I'm going to cut that eventually. So I'm going to stitch like 1/8 of an inch on either side of that line. And when I get down here, you can make a little arrowhead if you want, or you can go straight across in a box. I'm going to go straight across. And like I always tell everybody, like the machines default to way too small of a stitch, a home machine. This is the time where you can go below your small stitch. You want a teeny tiny stitch. So I'm on like almost a buttonhole stitch length, which we'll find out if it's too tiny or too long here in a second. Another good idea when like this is your first time doing this, you could start with a long stitch or make a sample to make sure that you know what's going on. Because if you had to take out these microscopic stitches, you're not going to be happy. So now I'm at the bottom of that line. Now I'm going to travel. We're making like a 1/4 inch space between the two things of thread. It's hard to see here. When I flip it over, it might show clearer. And then if you've done the continuous rectangle placket, this is similar, but it's a little bit easier. Okay, so now, I don't know if those show, but see I have like a 1/4 inch, and it doesn't really show. I have a 1/4 inch rectangle stitched in the placket down to the line. Now what I'm going to do from the side where I can see, so my stitches don't show as great on the armor weft side as they do on the fashion side. I am going to carefully cut right down the center of that sucker. This also works really well in the center back of a tutu's top plate. Then I'm cutting a little Y into the corner, and I don't want to clip the corner. If you think you clipped the corner, go back and restitch it. And if you don't clip to the corner, so can you see that little M opens up there? I've really clipped into my corner. Okay, now we're gonna take this, so it's right in the middle of our ruffle. Now we're gonna take, so we've got right side to right side. Now we're gonna flip it all the way through to the underside. So we're flipping that all the way through, and the first thing we're gonna do is press the edges nice so that we just have our 1/4 inch gap. Okay, so that's what I'm gonna do first. I'm gonna undo my other pins. And I'm going to go to the iron. And I am going to press both of these edges really nice first. So now we're on the inside of the skirt. And I'm probably going to end up pressing a ruffle weird on the outside, so you'll steam this later. So the first thing I want to do is get my edges worked out really nice. And see how nice and flat my bottom lays? If I didn't clip it to the corner, you'll have a little bubble right there. So you want to clip right up to the corner. Kind of press it with your fingers before you go for the iron. So now we're going to press that. Oh, come on, steam. There's some steam. I'm not even worried about the ruffles now. They're going to get steamed later. Now, this side that has 2/3 of it, that will become your underlap. So I'm going to lay my 2/3 down. And here's the stitch that's in the center back. I'm going to lay my 2/3 like a 1/4 inch past that because we're going to stitch that down. So there's my original stitch before we turned it inside out. I'm going to put a 1/4 inch more of my 2/3 beyond that stitch and press it again like that. So let me flip it over before we go back to the table. So now when we look at this, what we have is an overlap and an underlap, and the center backs of this will join the center back of our basque. So if she hooks it a little bit tighter, it's just going to overlap a little bit in the back. If she hooks it a little bit looser, you're going to see a little bit of the placket. But if it matches in a puffy skirt, in a ruffly skirt, nobody's ever going to see. So what we're going to do next is stitch this 1/4 inch that we overlapped. We're going to stitch right along that to catch that 1/4 inch. And since that has an itty bitty little seam allowance in there, what I actually like to do is do a zigzag so that I'm kind of reinforcing, right? If we just yanked on this really hard, we'd be able to rip the organza out of there. So I'm going to do an itty bitty zigzag, and then I'm going to zigzag along that edge because I don't want it to rip. And I've noticed that people who do live performance aren't always as careful with their things as you wish they would be. So now let's look on the back side of that and kind of see what we've got. So now on the back side of this, we've just got a little zigzag going down, holding that over. I'm a little drunk too. It's narrower at the top. So there's the back side. So underlap is good to go. Now on the overlap, right, we don't want to just stitch a hideous line through all of this stuff. But what we can do is figure out where the edge is. This is a good trick too. So I've got, let me get my ruffle looking nice here. I'm going to show you a total cheat. I'm going to get my ruffle looking roughly here and put a pin or two in it. Then what I'm going to do is fold this over and fold it back. And I'm going to do a zigzag, just barely catching the fabric on the left. This is like a total cheat. I saw this in a costume from Malbars, which is a rental place in Canada. So here, right now I can scoot. I've got my skirt base. I can go in here and pull the ruffle out of the way, or I can let the ruffle get caught. And I'm going to let the ruffle get caught. So I have half my zigzag going on. The center of my foot is centered where I folded this. And again, this is like a blind stitch. So if you have a sewing machine that does a blind stitch, look up a blind stitch. Then when I fold this over, all I've got are a couple itty bitty little pricks where the zigzag is, and I've got my ruffle kind of disguising that instead of doing a straight stitch all the way through it. But a straight stitch all the way through it is also fine. So there's our little closure in the back of our ruffled skirt. And let's see what time it is. We've got 10 minutes. So I'm going to show you how I'm going to start putting the ruffles on. And then I'll just email everybody later and say, we're finishing this on Friday, which is just a new way we do this stuff. But if you can't tune in on Friday, don't worry. You will still get the video. So we're going to add like a half an hour showing the skirt all done. So, but that's like, this is some of the main stuff I wanted to get to today, because we all understand spreading out and sewing miles of ruffle onto a skirt. But let's just get one section of ruffle on our skirt right now. Actually, we'll stick on two because that's more fun. Right, and then it's like I schedule every webinar, and then like 80,000 projects show up when there was no project when we scheduled the webinar. So the hem of this has not been hemmed, so I'm going to do the double bias and fold it over. That's going to happen. I say me like I'm going to do it. I might do it. But let's start putting on some ruffles. Did you guys like that placket? That's like one of my favorite things on earth. Now, look at all these ruffles. Oh, and I am going to ruffle a little bit with the pleating thing because we said I was going to. I want the 7-inch ruffle, the one where 7-inch shows. Is it working? Is it working? Does it look pretty? Sabina's recreating history, but in a fun way. Okay, so this one, we did ruffle on our ruffler just to see how close it gets. Because this is our one that's our 3.5 ratio. But I think it's too roughly, or it's too tight, which is all right, because I want to show you how you can deal with that. So I'm going to divide it in half. And actually, I'm going to just divide this into my 8 gores right now. So there's half. There's 1/4. But gathering stitch method is totally fine too. It's just whatever works for you. And what you don't want to do, if you're popping stitches to make it bigger or squishing it in to make it smaller, you still want to keep dividing things to make it as even as you can. So I've got this now with pins divided into 8. Boom, 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 boom. And I like it when the ruffles go on flat instead of going up and folding over. I think it just moves a little bit nicer. So we're going to put these on flat. So yeah, we have a question.
If you have a seam down center back, would you just adjust the seam allowance to cover that opening instead of a placket?
Somebody said, can you just use the center back of this for the opening and make a fatter seam allowance instead of a placket? You absolutely can. Since this one has 8 gores, I decided to put the placket in the middle so that I don't have a seam in the center front. So as I'm laying this sucker down, I am only need to gain about 2 inches per section. So my eighths of ruffle are only about 2 inches too big. Actually, I'm going to just pin some of this on. Actually, it's like 1.5 inches. So what I'm going to do, instead, I'm going to pop a couple stitches, but I don't want to just pop one section of stitches and open the whole thing up. And the other thing is, if you're doing this, if you're ruffling and then popping some stitches to enlarge your ruffle, you want to keep it really random. Don't pop it in the middle or the side on every single one. So see, here's my line for where this is going to go. It's going right there. And I'm coming up about 2 inches-ish shy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to clip stitches in like 3 spots. And then if I did this on the row above, I wouldn't clip the same 3 spots. So even though, we're all about like we want even stuff, we're at least keeping the same amount of ruffle in every 1/8 of the skirt. I hope that makes sense. But we don't want a big flat part either. So I'm just opening up a single little ruffle. I opened up 3. Let's see if we're going to open up a couple more. We're going to open up maybe 4 or 5. Because I don't want a big flat dead spot. I want it to be pretty. that's gonna do it. So now, since I've divided my ruffle into 8s, it's much easier to deal with putting this sucker on than trying to work with half or quarters. And like balance wise, I'm getting the same amount of fluff from edge to edge of every gore. And it looks like I need to do even another little pop. And if you have a Johnson ruffler or a ruffling foot, even though you might be saying like, oh my gosh, that's going to take so much time to pop those apart, it's going to take less time than it is trying to hand gather all of this. So I'm going to just deal section by section with that. So that's our first one. So I'm going to go through and put all 8 gores of this one on. Let's just actually set our second one up here. And what the finish up will be Friday is like hooking it together and finishing the boss. Well, I don't want to lose my note on this one. Let me really quickly divide this one into 8 and see if we've come up with the same thing. So as our ratio gets less, we're probably less likely to use our ruffling machine because it's a little bit tight even on a small thing. There's 1/8. The good thing is the skirt gores get narrower as we work our way up, but let's just have a look. Oh, not bad. This one I've only got to gain about 1 inch, so I'll be popping just a couple ruffles in that one. But look how nice. You can see it's getting shorter as we work our way up, and we have a good amount covering up each ruffle. And I think too, if you did this where that you start with it folded up and then sew it down, it's going to be too puffy underneath each layer, and you're going to end up with a sophisticated snowball instead of a sophisticated beautiful pink dress. So the other thing that we looked at this yesterday, so gathering stitches, one of these layers we're going to end up gathering by hand because as we get less volume going up, we don't want to use our ruffler because it's just going to be too tight and we'll be popping all the stitches. And I don't know if it translates well, but hopefully you can see that this bottom row per 8, this is considerably rufflier and fuller than this next row up. It's getting a little bit less voluminous so that we keep that kind of sweeping triangle feel, which is why we did ratios that decrease going up the skirt. This is going to be so pretty. Then get that out of the way. We've got the one here that I said we would look again at using a pleater. So I am going to just imagine that I've got strings, and I'm going to say I only need 2 strings. So I'm going to cut off 2 strings. You could take all the extra needles out that you don't need. If my high hip, or where this ruffle is getting sewn on, is 38 inches, your strings need to be 38 inches plus a little bit to deal with because you're going to want to knot the ends and stuff. But what you would do with this is you could roll the whole thing up on a dowel. So you would take a dowel and roll it all the way up, getting your edge matching really, really nice, okay? But for the sake of time, I am just going to stick it right into the pleater. So if it's on a dowel, it's going to fit underneath here better, because if your ruffle is too long, you want it fitting inside the pleater rather than smashing up against the edge. And actually this top needle, I'm going to kind of place my top edge between these 2 needles. So even though there's a needle in there where nothing is happening. Oh, my lace went a little drunk. So you would just start to feed that on. And actually you'll see, I don't know if it shows, there's spots on this sucker where there's like Sharpie mark. I've marked on here before where I'm feeding an end in, just so I can be consistent in what I'm doing. So that's a lot easier to gather up for me than it is doing it with the sewing machine gathering threads, although that works too. And now I'm going to have to take the bar out and run this whole piece through because I started it. So that's where we're going to call it quits for today. Look for a link for our Friday finish up, but don't worry if you can't make it. it's not a problem because you're going to get the same info. And I'd rather break it up to give us time to sew all this on instead of not showing you something. So we're going to add a little bit on Friday. Cool. Let's see. Oh, let's show them Sabina's trim. Ooh, that looks really good. Can you throw it over here? And this is the sample one, right?
Yeah.
I think let's do a lot of loops that are shorter, much shorter. But check this out. So this I saw in an old, on a Renaissance, not a Renaissance, a restoration dress. So where there was a piece of lace on a ruffle, and then they went under the lace and then over the lace and made kind of like all these loops hooked together out of ribbon. So we're going to use this on the hem of our gigantic Mother Ginger skirt. And look how cool that's going to be bouncing around on stage until some kid puts their foot in it. But yeah, that's what we're doing. How cool is that? That's it. Thanks, everybody. Oh, then the other thing about this, right? Like this ruffle needs to be like 40 feet of ruffle when it's done. We're going to do it in a bunch of small pieces and then hook them together instead of trying to make one gigantic thing. It would take forever.
Friday or Thursday?
Friday. Friday, Friday, Friday. If I said Thursday, I meant Friday. And we'll just do it at the same time. Or it might be noon. We'll see. But you'll get the recording. That's it. Thanks. Let's make some ruffles. It's going to work. I'm excited.